This is a 1986 C4 Corvette, and we're going to start by marking the top ball joint rivets. We're going to put a dimple in the middle of each one. I do that before I take anything off because with the extra mass of this, it doesn't move around as much. Once you take off this knuckle, it gets pretty flexible up here, and it's really hard to make dimples in these top rivets. In fact, it's not a bad idea to just go ahead and try to grind the rivets out and take at least the top parts of these, maybe even loosen up this top piece before you take off the rest of the assembly. I also do the top one first because we make quite a bit of mess with our shavings down here on the bottom ball joint, and this ball joint will then get, with those filings, could get contaminated with the new one. So as long as we do the new one at the top first and then the new ball joint at the bottom, we're good. Okay, so I've got my centering punch. You can see that with the punch I have gone ahead and dimpled each of those rivets. I now have my drill, and with this drill I'm going to go ahead. I've got about a 0.3 inch sized bit here, also called a Type O. If you've got the Harbor Freight kit, that should allow me to drill these out pretty good. We'll just go ahead and start drilling. My goal right now is just to drill out the tops of these rivets down probably at least halfway or more into the actual base or metal of this top piece. I'll come back in just a moment. Okay, so now you can see that I've drilled those holes out. Once again, I used a size 0 bit, which is around 0.311 inches. And I drilled them out down to about the thickness of that base, maybe just a little bit lower. So I should be completely drilled through. It'll still be on there pretty hard. I'm going to go ahead now and try to air hammer it loose a little bit just to, well, actually, why don't I'm going to go ahead and take my nuts off down here. I'll go ahead and remove this knuckle. So just remove that nut there. Obviously it's got a keeper in it. And then one down on that nut right down there. Go ahead and remove those, and you can go ahead and use a pickle fork to remove the U-joint, or the ball joints. All right, the bottom bolt, I used a 21mm open-end wrench. The top ball joint bolt was 18mm. Those came off real easy. I now have my pickle fork and my sledge, and probably just take a couple of quick taps. They usually pop off pretty quickly. And you can see they're popped off. Sorry about that, it was probably pretty jerky, but it popped off right there, about 4 or 5 taps. I'm going to do the lower one, pull that yoke out of the way, and we'll go ahead and work on removing the rest of that upper ball joint. Okay, I've got my air chisel. Of course, you can just use a standard flat chisel with a sledgehammer and try to knock this loose. The air chisel is kind of a nice tool. They're not very expensive. I use it for a bunch of different things. Actually, if this wasn't such a thick aluminum boss, you might be able to take an air chisel on the end with a pointed air chisel and push the rivets out. But on these Corvettes, this aluminum boss, this is about 3/4 of an inch thick, pretty much bonds to that rivet. So drilling the rivet out is the only way to go. All right, well, let's see if we can just put this here between the base of that ball joint and the aluminum and see if we can knock her loose. Okay, I've got it knocked loose. I'll go ahead and set this down here. We'll take this piece off, and the ball joint is off. Okay, now you can see the rivets. What we're going to do there now is we really only have one choice, and that, like I said, you're not going to push them out. You can drill them out. Once again, you can see that the size is about a 1/4 20 bolt. Those are 1/2 inch bolts that you can put in there. So that's probably the easiest thing to do, is just to drill that out and put 1/4 20 grade 8 bolts with lock nuts on them. We're going to go do that next. I'll drill these out and come back. Okay, I'm using a 9/32 inch bit. The key thing here is to make sure that you're perpendicular to the surface at all times, both this way and this way. So constantly check, because you don't want to drill through here at an angle. You want to try to maintain it as perpendicular as possible to that surface. And we're trying to really drill out the rivet, not the aluminum. So, I mean, you're going to take a little bit of aluminum, but not much. Just sometimes to follow the rivet, you have to kind of move the bit a little bit so you're staying straight through. Once you get into the aluminum boss, it'll be a little easier to keep straight, of course, as long as you went in straight. Just do one for right now. I'll show you what to do next. Okay, now I've ground down the other 3 rivets, being careful not to get into the aluminum. I have my hole all the way through right here, and I also cleaned this surface and cleaned this hole to make sure it was in good shape, so the ball joint would sit flat. You can see now I've placed the ball joint into position here. You'll notice that you might have a little jockeying to do, and that's why we're doing it the way I'm doing it here. I need to go ahead and place my first bolt in here, and then I've drilled one through. I ended up using that O bit. Actually, I went one size smaller than the O bit to upgrade to the 5/16 inch by 1.5 inch long bolt. Just looked a little beefier. I've heard people using the 1/4 inch, but I didn't like how it fit. So I bolted one side, I clamped the other side, I tried to get it as straight as possible. Now I'm going to do the top 2 bolts and then use the plate here as a guide to make sure everything's lined up real good. And I'll finish those other 3. Okay, about halfway done. Now I just need to do those last 2. By the way, make sure you put your grease zerk in before you start drilling. You wouldn't want to get metal filings inside your new ball joint. And just go slow and easy. It's taking me about 15-20 minutes per hole. You have to go through quite a bit of material, and those are steel rivets. So go slow, go straight, and make big chips. I'm going to do the lower ball joint. You'll need a ball joint press. You can get those pretty cheap at Harbor Freight or online or something. It'll come with 2 cups. One has the big hole in the top. That's the one that will go through the top of the ball bearing, the ball joint when you install it and remove it. This is the top. This has these serrations. This is used for these spacers here. You have a big one and a small one. The big one is the one you're going to want to use on the bottom when you press out the bottom, okay? The small one is the one you're going to use on the top when you install the new ball joint, okay? But we're going to remove the old one now, so I'll set up the press. Okay, this is what the press looks like. You can see I've got the cup with the large hole in it on the top, sitting right on the ball joint. I have the very large spacer on the bottom with the cup that has the small hole in on the bottom, and then I have my press below that. I'm going to attach my gun, make sure it's on. We'll watch that bolt joint being pressed out. Bingo, it's out. Okay, you'll want to clean off that hole really good. You don't want any dirt in there. I also grabbed the bottom ball joint and I'm pulling off the seal. We'll put the seal on after the ball joint's installed. You want a nice, good, clean chamfer there. We're going to set the ball joint in place, try to get it as straight as you can. We'll put the press on it. Remember, the large hole for the cup goes in the top, the small on the bottom. And we need to make sure we use a spacer that's big enough to go where this ball joint can go inside of it, but not so big it extends beyond the outside of this. Okay, this is what the press looks like. Cup with a large hole, a little smaller diameter spacer, cup with a small hole, your press, you're pressing in the bottom of the bearing. The challenge is to make sure that that goes in straight. So watch it, go slow. You may need to move this cup around a little bit so that you're putting pressure on different ends of it so that you can get it to go in straight. Once it starts going in straight, then you can take it all the way up. Okay, once your lower ball joint is in, we're ready to go for installing our yoke again. So we just put a breaker bar in here, pry bar in here, basically lift up on this assembly while you slip in the yoke between the two. And we're all set. Now all you need to do is put in your nuts, go ahead and put in your cotter pins, lock the assembly together, and you're golden. Hope this was helpful.